Hello, and thank you everybody for joining us at Driven 2021. Welcome to today's episode featuring Camunda's CEO and founder, Jakob Freund. Before I hand things off to Scott, I want to encourage you to use our chat feature to ask any questions that may arise during our interview. At the end of today's interview, Scott and Jakob will be answering questions in the chat live. Also in the chat, I've placed a link to register for the live raffle of Beats EarPods today. It's important that you use your work email when registering for the raffle, as we must comply with corporate and government guidelines. With all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass things off to Scott.
Thank you, Julia. And Jakob, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott. Very glad to be here.
You know, Camunda and BP3 have a lot of kind of interesting parallel shared history, right? We both got into process automation at an early stage. You know, if I recall correctly, Camunda has been in the process automation space since maybe as early as 2008. And yeah.
Exactly.
And, and we started BP3 in 2007. So we were kind of following this interesting path of interest in process automation. You know, your mission today, as I've heard you explain it many times, is to help organizations automate any process anywhere. You know, what does that mean to you, Jakob? You know, what do you want, you know, your clients to take away from that message?
Yeah, so the whole idea here is that we see Camunda, our product, as what we call universal process orchestrator. And what we mean by that is that with Camunda, you can actually orchestrate any possible endpoint of a business process. Let it be people, let it be systems, applications, and even physical devices. So you can orchestrate all of that along a flowchart model in the BPMN standard that is suited to bring business and IT together for the sake of automating your business process truly from one end to the other, like the end-to-end process automation. And you can do all of that reliably, like highly resilient, highly available at scale. So even if you have like sudden peaks of transactions and volume. So this is the combination of strengths that we see that Camunda bears, that really put Camunda in a unique position in the market, because the whole vision here is that once you can orchestrate anything, you can automate everything. So hence automate any process anywhere.
I love it. I mean, there are, and you know, as you mentioned, there are a lot of companies that are kind of in the space, but they all have sort of different takes on how to approach process automation. And I gather, you know, from your answer, part of the differentiator is that you're really trying to address process automation, however human-centric or however automated, right? That whole spectrum from, you know, very human-centric to completely straight through processing, and in all sorts of different architectural, you know, tech stacks and deployment scenarios. Am I capturing that the right way, Jakob?
No, that's spot on, actually. So it's that flexibility that our customers also appreciate. So we don't come in and say, hey, you have to do like everything within this one, you know, monolithic black box called our superior product. We actually acknowledge that you already have a certain infrastructure in place, that you might prefer to run Camunda in a certain deployment setup, that you might prefer to, for example, not use the provided user interfaces of Camunda, but actually code against the APIs and have your own user interfaces to involve your people, for example. So Camunda really thinks of end-to-end process orchestration as something that needs to fit nicely into an existing architecture.
You know, in recent, analyst research, there's been a lot written about hyperautomation, you know, over the last year, maybe two. Gartner listing it as a top technology trend in the enterprise heading into 22. You know, what's driving interest in hyperautomation from your perspective? And, you know, how do you relate that hyperautomation story with this sort of end-to-end process automation view?
Yeah, actually, it fits together quite nicely. So yes, in general, we were seeing a huge interest in process automation, like, you know, automating the heck out of your business. That's what's really driving many enterprises right now, because it's like sort of the core element of digital transformation. So that's the topic in general. Now we have hyper automation as a particular term, I think coined by Gartner in particular, and their basic idea is that you have a combination of technologies. So, for example, process orchestration like Camunda, but also, for example, RPA, robotic process automation, AI, process mining. So you combine all of that in your what they call hyper automation technology stack, and it means that end-to-end process automation, we're looking at a business process holistically. So, for example, from the moment that we receive an order to its successful execution. And the big difference between end-to-end automation and, say, for example, RPA is that RPA is always about local task automation. So it's part of the picture, but not the entire picture. So that's why combining Camunda as an end-to-end process orchestration technology with an RPA product, for example, can make a lot of sense for this hyper automation tech stack.
Yeah, no, I think that matches well. I guess, the other question I have, if you look at like Forrester analysis, you'll see a lot of discussion around digital process automation and RPA. Or if you look at HFS, they talk about the one office or the automation trifecta, right, if you will. How are these all, in your view, kind of different ways or different lenses to see the same set of automation challenges? Or, do you see them as fundamentally different and you have to kind of understand each one as its own animal?
I guess a mix of both in a way, in the sense that, the reality is just what we just discussed. In order to be successful with automation, you need to put together your stack. And it's not like a one-size-fits-all thing. It's certainly not, it's this one vendor's product that can solve all your needs. So you need to put together a stack of products that really make sense in your case. And that's what Gartner tries to describe as hyper-automation. I believe that's also what you can read with Forrester, HFS, and others. Certainly at the same time, those analysts always sort of need to justify their existence to some degree by also providing their, especially insightful analysis of the situation. And I think it's good, actually. It means, and they're very smart and well informed. So I think it makes sense to get the full picture by looking at those different elements and different angles and combining them in order to get this holistic picture of what really makes sense for your own enterprise.
Well, let's kind of talk a little bit about clients. You've got kind of an amazing roster of clients with Camunda. Some of the biggest banks, the biggest insurers, financial services brands. But fundamentally, we talked about Camunda being a very horizontal, technology to automate any process anywhere in almost any technical stack or situation. So, how do you think about, how Camunda fits in these big industry verticals, but also yet still a great fit from a horizontal perspective across industry verticals?
Yeah, I think it's really, as you just said, Camunda is a product. Process orchestration as a software category, if you will, that's industry agnostic. So, of course, the data, the people, the specific systems, applications involved, they differ from industry to industry. But the problem of how to orchestrate any endpoint along a business process, that's basically always the same, and it can be solved in the same way. So that part is really agnostic of industries or verticals. At the same time, there's, of course, you could say, a natural gravitational pull for Camunda towards financial services or insurances, but that's mostly because the need for process automation in order to transform themselves digitally, reinvent themselves, that is most pressing in those industries. They're super aware of that. So in that sense, yes, there's a certain gravitation towards those banks, etc., that you can find in our portfolio of customers. But then again, we also have users from entirely different domains. For example, 24-hour fitness, or the US Department of Veterans Affairs, or even NASA, which is one of my favorite examples, like the Mars mission. Those are sort of outliers, of course, but they give us this understanding that you can and truly automate any process anywhere, which is kind of cool.
A lot of what's driving these companies, we talked about the banks but not just the banks, right, and financial services, but many other industries. We're seeing this in healthcare in the US today. A lot of what's driving it is a need to transform their business. I know that sort of term digital transformation has both been very popular and also criticized quite a bit. But I think that fundamental shift of modernizing applications, moving applications to the cloud, really, it is a digital transformation, like it or not, right? And that kind of flexibility you're describing really brings forward these kinds of opportunities. But I think the other wave underneath that is microservices. And, I guess I'm curious, how has that rise of microservices, that sort of tidal wave really of microservices, how's that been a driver for Camunda's business?
Yeah, I mean, microservices like in itself is of course like a very popular topic. So it's a key concept, you could say, for any digital enterprise nowadays. Like it's hard to imagine that any truly digital enterprise, no matter if in banking, insurance, whatever, that it will not be based on microservices eventually, like sooner or later. They're all becoming software companies of some sort. But of course, once you have hundreds or even thousands of microservices, you like technically have lots of events floating around, and you will eventually lose sight of that large scale flow. That's how Martin Fowler coined it. And I think he really got a point there. So you lose sight of that larger scale flow, aka the business process. So microservices orchestration can fix that. You get like end-to-end visibility, but you also get control and resilience, because you can again orchestrate any endpoint microservice reliably at scale, which is one particular challenge in microservices architectures. So that's exactly one of the core use cases for Camunda, embraced by, I would say, not just dozens, but maybe even hundreds of our customers today. So yes, it has played a big role for our own success as well.
Yeah, and I guess, Jacob, I remember the very first demonstration you guys did of the engine that it now runs all those microservices orchestrations. And I remember even at the time, the curious thing to me was, how did you have the insight that this was a need in the market that Camunda could meet, right? Like, what was the insight that led to going down that path of orchestrating microservices?
Well, quite honestly, I can't claim credit for that. So in this case, it was mostly, I mean, lots of people at Camunda actually contributed to that, but two names come to my mind right away. Our CTO, Daniel Meyer, and my co-founder, Ben Rücker. So they have been quite into microservices and microservices architectures like years ago already. And I would say Bernd, my co-founder, he takes very much the practical application perspective. So he's really in that community of microservices and has learned about the challenges that come up once you introduce that architecture years ago already. Daniel, on his end, he's very much into highly scalable, highly resilient automation technologies, basically. So he came up with a vision of, hey, how to really reinvent this sort of tech, and instead of being based on relational databases, think of event streaming, event processing directly to the hard drive in order to achieve like true horizontal scalability. So you combine those two things, someone who's very much aware of the challenges and how they will materialize over time, and someone who has a clear vision for a innovative technology to solve that problem. You bring these two things together. I was just, if you will, benefiting and trying to steer all of that into a direction that would then turn into a product eventually.
This kind of leads me maybe to the next question, Jacob. Given that context around microservices, how do your clients avoid the sort of death by Amazon that they might confront? Given, Amazon is sort of eating the world. We used to say software was eating the world. I think, maybe Amazon is eating the world, right? And how do they avoid that with, is Camunda part of that story for how they can avoid that sort of fear of Amazon, if you will?
No, it's actually like both statements are true about Amazon and software eating the world, because I would argue that Amazon is eating the world of business thanks to their software. That's the whole point. And not just the software, but of course technology plays a huge role in that. So as I like to say, Amazon's secret sauce is to provide this superior, truly superior customer experience while being operationally efficient. That's what they really bring together. And any company that can figure that out will dominate their competitors. So they will become the Amazon of the industry. But only if they're fast enough, if they figure that out before their competitors do, or Amazon does themselves. So if you think of, like the first business, bookstore, like selling books, like how innovative is selling books? Is probably one of the oldest businesses around. So very mature in that sense. But Amazon figured out how to provide that superior customer experience paired with that efficiency, and suddenly, bam, everything changes. So that can happen in any industry. So any established enterprise needs to, in that sense, reinvent themselves. Or honestly die sooner or later, like those bookstore chains did. So they have to transform digitally, but they have this one big problem, which is legacy. Like their legacy systems, like decades old applications written in COBOL, for example, their legacy infrastructure, like the on-prem data center, legacy devices in some cases. So they are like, if you will, technical debts they need to overcome, but they cannot just rip like all of that out and replace it with some super fancy microservices-based architecture on the greenfield, like Amazon did initially, at least, right? So that's really that challenge. They need to get to that modern, scalable, customer-friendly architecture, but not in a big banger overnight fashion. They need this gradual transformation where they systematically replace parts of their legacy infrastructure with a modernized alternative, like step by step, until that transformation is complete. And Camunda, again, that's really what we're seeing, like again and again and again. Camunda is this key enabler. So it allows you to orchestrate both legacy technology as well as, for example, RPA bots as an, if you will, in between stepstone, all the way to microservices, and even like within the same business process, like step 1 legacy tech, step 2 RPA bot, step 3 microservice. And that allows you actually to basically like bridge the gap between your own legacy world and your new Amazonish digital me.
No, I think it's a really good point, that avoiding those sort of big bang deployments is so important, because it takes too long to get to the market value that you're looking for, and there's too much risk in the project. Whereas if you go incrementally, you're also, I think in software terms, right, you're learning as you go. And I think that feedback loop is just so important, right, for your software development team, for your business to evolve and evolve those applications to support your business as you go, rather than assume your requirements will be right for, the next 3 years, right?
Exactly.
I think it's really, really critical. I think the other key point I heard you mention there, Jacob, that I think really resonates with me is the idea of being efficient while also providing top-notch, right, top-tier customer service. That doing those two things together is really important. And in many cases, being efficient, or the automation behind the scenes, the processes behind the scenes, are what enable you to create that great customer service and customer experience. And I think too often we think of automation like, maybe voicemail automation, or like the voice assistant stuff that everybody gets frustrated when you get lost in the
yeah, that sucks.
call tree. But that's a sort of 1990s, version of automation. And we're really talking about, as a customer, how do I find out where my order is? Is that quick? Is it fast? Is it accurate? How do I find out where my package is? I mean, those are things that we all expect to be very quick and relatively accurate. And you get frustrated when you use a shipping service that can't give you that accuracy, right?
Exactly.
This is one small example.
Yeah. Exactly. Our customers are spoiled. I mean, they're trained by Amazon to expect to get their stuff like anytime, right away on their doorstep, and they're expecting that same sort of big experience from their bank and their insurance and telco and whatever. Why not? And yes, that's exactly what you just said. Automation sometimes is seen as especially like a cost saver or anything like that, which of course is true. However, the real game changer is the fact that it provides this incredible customer experience without, adding more costs, like increasing your OpEx. Quite the contrary, actually. Yeah, secret sauce.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think another topic you brought up in the previous question, I think we maybe should press on a little more, is RPA and the opportunities and maybe potholes, right, inherent with RPA. As you know, BP3, we do quite a bit of RPA implementation for our clients, as well as process automation, and we have definitely a sense for how they can go together. But I'm very much interested in sharing with our audience your perspective on that.
Yeah, so that's actually funny, in a way, microservices and RPA are pretty similar, actually. Right. So they're both like super popular topics. They're often a great fix for certain challenges. They're great for like a local decentral adoption. So they spring up like mushrooms in your organization, And of course, at a certain point, they might be growing over your head and like then explode into your face like bam. So losing sight of the large scale flow can happen with microservices just as well as with RPA. That's really interesting. We saw that happening, for example, at Deutsche Telekom, like the biggest carrier in Europe. And they have quite an impressive RPA journey under their belt already. So hundreds, I think even thousands of bots that they've introduced in their customer services unit, huge cost savings. So really beneficial. However, at a certain point, very hard to maintain, very hard to keep under control with regards to the end-to-end process, hence the actual customer experience. So it started to become an issue. And what they did was introducing, again, Camunda as an orchestration layer. And that's also their number one advice now that they're giving when you're giving their presentations. So start with an orchestration layer, basically right from the start. Don't put a lot of workflow and decision logic into your bots, but keep them simple, really. And then eventually, potentially even replacing them over time with an API/microservices-based local automation without even touching the process necessarily. So they put a Camunda in place to orchestrate the bots, to mitigate the challenges they saw. And now they're actually taking those bots and one by one replace them with a more, let's say, future-proof, sustainable automation approach, which is not always necessary, but especially for, let's say, your key differentiating mission-critical core business processes might make sense, of course, because we all know that RPA is typically a temporary, not a permanent solution in those situations.
Now you have this year, you've been featuring the release of Camunda Cloud, and I thought maybe we should take a moment to talk about that. It features the workflow automation engine designed for kind of horizontal scalability and high throughput workflows. Talk to us a little bit about that move to process automation as a service in the cloud. What kind of opportunities you think Camunda Cloud kind of opens up for your customers?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really, I would say it's two big things. So the first one is simply the operations of a process automation platform. Like operating such a platform yourself, that can be quite a challenge when it comes to making sure it's always up and running, it's highly available, it's resilient, there's great latency. So that's something that you'll need to take care of and pay a lot of attention to. If you want to, for example, go from, I don't know, like 2 nines to 4 or 5 nines of high availability, that's the sort of stuff that can be quite a challenge. So Camunda Cloud, in its software as a service offering, that takes care of that. So it's cloud native tech, as you said, it's highly scalable, it's highly resilient, it's running on GCP, but you don't even need to worry about that where it's running. So it's that typical value proposition of a SaaS offering. And for infrastructure typically means, hey, we make sure it's there for you. You can rely on that. That's the first value, if you will, of the SaaS offering. The other one is also a usual one that you know from other SaaS products. It's much easier to just quickly adopt it in your organization. Especially for your first pilot, your first team specific local automation, where you just need to put something together quickly, get your feet wet with the technology, maybe have something to show to get buy-in for a bigger project. So what we see happening, for example, is that a local team just adopts it, let's say within IT, in a SaaS fashion, and then later on actually move to the on-prem version because they say, hey, now we're rolling it out at scale within the organization, and we have certain requirements around data residence, etc. And then they just move over to on-prem, which is just fine. So that's also an interesting motion.
Yeah. No, I think the element of being able to postpone some of those architectural decisions is fantastic, right? A chance to really get started. And if Camunda Cloud as is works for you, then you're off to the races. And if you need it to be, more integrated with your existing infrastructure and tech stack, you of course can still do that. And I love the fact that you have that optionality going forward, right? You're not sort of stuck one way or the other. You just have all those options in front of you.
Yeah,
but I think that startup effort though can be a challenge for folks if they're not familiar with a new software technical stack item like this. If they're not familiar with it, it can be a little bit of a challenge. I think Camunda Cloud does a great job addressing that. I was speaking about just getting people started. What other recommendations would you have for somebody, in our audience who might be thinking about getting started with Camunda? What are the kinds of things you would recommend that they think about, to make that, I guess, as smooth as possible, what advice would you have?
Yeah, so maybe let's just make an assumption first. Let's assume that that our audience right now that they work in IT. Let's assume that they're like in an IT department, maybe developer, maybe architect, project lead. I don't know, maybe VP of engineering. I don't know, but someone who has a certain proficiency for, let's say, serious process automation. But they want to get their feet wet. They don't know yet Camunda World or BPMN. So here's one, let's say, recipe that they could just follow. Just sign up for Camunda Cloud SaaS. It's just a one-click experience. Basically, you can log in with your social, log in GitHub or Google, whatever you like. Just sign up for the SaaS offering, run your first process right away. It's actually a matter of minutes. Like seriously, you can, for example, there's a microservices orchestration guide online. You can follow that, and within, I think, 5 to 10 minutes, you're able to orchestrate, I don't know, let's say a piece of Java code that's running on your computer, for example. So like engine in the cloud, you have your on-prem code being orchestrated by Camunda in the cloud. It really works. So pretty straightforward, and you have your first, let's say, idea of it. Let's assume that you familiarize yourself more with Camunda. You're actually comfortable, maybe also like your team. So let's say you consider now using it for real, for your team, maybe even for the entire department or even the entire company. So then you would actually get serious about it and have your first automation project. So maybe you want to move to self-managed, because that's an option in that situation, as we just discussed, not a problem. Maybe you want to work with a great SI partner like BP3 to actually get going faster and implement it right away. That's where it makes a ton of sense to have strong partners by your side. So you can do that. If the business lines buy-in, which sometimes isn't there yet, if it's not there yet in the beginning, so you're within IT, but the business isn't yet, allocating serious funds, you could consider automating your IT internal process first. Often we see that happening, like ITSM workflows. I don't know, workplace setup, maybe server provisioning, stuff that you're authorized to make happen yourselves without any like broad buy-in. You can use that as a lighthouse, like a showcase. So you have meetings with business lines, maybe like in the context of deciding upon budgets for the next year, etc. And they typically, like once they see like the flowchart models, and they see and optimize the heat map, and oh wow, now I have this real-time insights, what's going on. So typically they get this appetite and ask if you could provide something like for their process too. So then you automate the first real core process, and you demonstrate the value by measuring KPI. For example, again, using Camunda Optimize for that is really, really helpful. It's like cycle time reduced by 30%, etc. That's really when you get the buy-in for the next process and the next one. So like going from one to the next. And you, like in a bigger organization, let's say the end goal typically is that you productize Camunda internally. So you turn it into your own branded in-house automation platform that you provision to other developer teams, potentially with even out-of-the-box components they can use right away. So Goldman Sachs, for example, Goldman Sachs have the Camunda-powered Goldman Sachs workflow automation platform, like 60,000 employees actually using that. That's also a nice career boost for the people involved. So that's sort of the, let's say, happy path that navigates the typical impediments that you might face on the way.
Right. No, I think that last bit of branding it and really taking it out to your own corporation is a key point that's often overlooked, right? Because that, as you're branding it and taking it out to the rest of your company, you can also include kind of standard tech stack stuff that you think for your company, these are the right combinations of technical stack to deliver results. Stay standard with your architecture team, and just have automatic buy-in within your company as you roll it out farther. And you do get those kudos internally, right? Everybody knows who the core team is that delivered that. I think circling back to a couple other points you made that I think are kind of interesting. For the IT team, some things to, if you're looking at building software and it occurs to you that you need to build a state machine, or that several of you are building state machines in different parts of your business, that is the kind of thing that should ring a bell to maybe go look at something like Camunda, a process engine, because what you might have is a process rather than a state machine. And trust me, there are lots of pitfalls, I should say, for building state machines, right? Where you can make a mistake And then if you build 10 of them and 10 different people build them, you'll make 10 different sets of mistakes, right? And process engines really have sorted these things out, right? And use something like Camunda, all of the state engine stuff will just work, right? And so then you can worry about designing the right state machine, right? Like what are the states and how do they relate to each other, and forget all the infrastructure of how it works under the hood, which is kind of just a tidbit of like something you might notice while you're working, is like, oh, we're building a state machine. Hit pause, check out a process engine for that.
Yeah, exactly. You wouldn't build your own database, right? So why would you build your own state machine or your own process engine? Actually, it just doesn't make sense. Like focus on the stuff that really sets you apart from your competitors. And it's not yet another state machine.
Right. No, that's right. Not another generic state machine, right? And then I think a second element there on the sort of IT business buy-in, I think one of the key things that we found really helpful for creating business buy-in is getting diagrams in BPMN, showing them processes that they really understand, and some of the layering of complexity in those processes. And I really mean by starting with the simple and then working right down to more engineering detail so that they can see how their business relates to what might be implemented in BPMN, and then how that might be layered with more details as you actually implement and go out and integrate to various systems. And I think that really helps them get sort of make it more concrete, even though you could argue a BPMN diagram is kind of abstract, but it is a concrete representation of an abstract concept, right? You get a real diagram, I can draw it on the whiteboard. It is the thing that will actually execute. So when your software development team builds it, that is what will run, right? That diagram and what runs are the same. And that's really powerful. And I think people lose sight of that. And folks like Jakob and I are used to it. So sometimes we take it for granted, but in the rest of the software world, that is unusual, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's really interesting. Like this what you just stated is totally spot on. Like you're actually looking at the source code. It's a flowchart model that describes your business process that you can understand. There's, like there's a little clock and there's like a little envelope and it stands for like a message and the clock stands for, oh, this is the deadline. And you're actually literally looking at the source code, not just the one that's like going to run, it's the one that might be even running right now. And that is an incredibly powerful concept and element, and we're getting that also mirrored from our customers like time and again. So it's really like, as I like to say, we're having this conversation now. You're being American, me German, but we can have the conversation because we both speak English. Like, how powerful is that? And BPMN is exactly that. It's like speaking English within your organization for processes. So incredibly powerful.
Well, Jakob, thank you so much for joining us, sitting down and sharing great information with myself and our viewers today. For everyone watching at home, please stay tuned as we transition to the live Q&A portion, and be on the lookout for that link in the chat box to enter our Beats noise canceling earphones raffle. And due to the nature of the raffle, you must register with your work email to be included. So thank you for supporting us through that. And Jakob, again, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. It was a great conversation. Looking forward to many more great things to come together.
You bet.
Take care.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and transition into our live Q&A. So if we can have Scott and Jakob come on camera, and we'll go ahead and get that party started.
All right. Well, thank you, Jakob.
Hi, Scott. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. So look, we've got some great questions have come in. So I thought we'll just kind of run through them. I think, as usual, right, the questions from the audience are always better than the ones we can come up with. So, look, I think one of the questions that came in was, is it more difficult to start these sort of process transformation efforts in some verticals than others? Is there something particular about some verticals that makes it hard or easy?
So I just need to think about that quickly. And it's certainly sometimes more challenging in some organizations than in others. I am not exactly certain that it correlates with the industry. It can have all sorts of different reasons. Just to give you one example, in Germany, we have pretty strong employment laws, also related to data protection and data privacy. So sometimes when rolling out process automation in a German organization as top management, you need to make sure you have the so-called Works Council on board, because they have to approve certain measures that might make it easier to supervise employees' performance, basically. And of course, like great side effect of process automation is that you get real-time data on things like cycle time and idle time. And that can, of course, then, in relation to, for example, a human task orchestration use case, lead to that sort of situation, which can then be at least an impediment to overcome before you can actually roll out the solution. So this is just like one tiny example, but it speaks to this like sort of diversity of impediments or things to observe when introducing process automation. And now come back to your question. I mean, of course, we have specific regulations that are in place, for example, in finance or in the public administration. But I honestly can't think of any specific vertical that is populated by bigger enterprises where that is outstanding in that sense. So the answer would be no, I guess.
Yeah, and I have to say, just from my perspective, as running a services firm, I think I can't think of any particular technical reasons why, or business context reasons why some industries are more easily able to adopt than others. But I think one thing is true is some of our clients, or the verticals that they're in, are under more pressure, and they have accepted, so there's a different degrees of acceptance of, I have to focus on this. And so sometimes there's more receptivity to taking on process automation, which is, or digital transformation, which is different from, is it easier? Well, it may still be really hard, but I accept that it's a challenge I have to take on, right?
Yeah. That is true. And I mean, yes, that's actually a great point that you make. For example, also, I believe in some industries, we're seeing already a higher degree of structured work, in the sense of there's clarity on the daily operations. There's not so much ambiguity and dependence on knowledge workers that somehow magically know, what needs to happen in the process. So we're seeing that, I guess, again, in finance and insurance and telco, more than in other, like healthcare, for example, sometimes. There it is often more difficult to identify exact repeated operations that you could then also apply for process automation. So yes, now thinking about that a bit more, I guess there are actually certain correlations. That is fair.
Well, there's another good question about getting started, and this is sort of the age-old debate, Jacob, of should we just pick a process and execute it, right? Like, let's get through this one automation and get it right. Or should we start, should we fan out and tackle multiple processes? How quickly do we move from the first thing we do to tackling N processes, if you will? And I think this is a really, this is a debate that I have heard kind of waged over many years, of like, how fast do you branch out? Do you start out branched, or do you start out with one thread? Do you have a thought about that from your experience or watching your clients?
I'm almost tempted to hear your thought first to see if we're aligned, but I'm happy to go first, and then you can feel totally free to counter me or challenge me on that. I think at Camunda as a company, and me also personally, we heavily lean towards divide and conquer, divide a big effort into smaller chunks that you can actually conquer one after the other in an iterative, agile fashion. So I would always gravitate towards, let's pick the one process, let's make it happen as quickly as possible, put it in production, see how it works, measure the benefit, the value, and then learn and take it from there. The only, not exception, but the only natural evolution, of course, that can happen is that you realize, wait a minute, this technology Camunda and also this practice of process automation is a horizontal solution to potentially many problems that we can solve in a very efficient combined way. And this is where you embark on the process automation platform journey that we also discussed with, for example, Goldman Sachs, etc. So you might go from selected processes to the general automation platform, but I would always advise to look at selected processes first at the beginning. And I don't know if that resonates with you or maybe not at all. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a logic sort of risk mitigation, right, of starting with something with one process and make sure you execute well on that and kind of establish a pattern of success. And I think that logic holds true so long as the first thing you pick matters to your business. I think if you pick a toy problem, something that doesn't matter, you want to get out of that mode as fast as you can, right? If you're going to pick something that's just sort of technology experiment, right? We're going to do this proof of technology, then move into real stuff. Well, make that POT happen really fast, because the longer you spend working on things that don't have value to your business, the more risk your program takes on. So we always like to get our clients to move past that phase of, kind of experimentation to let's actually put this thing to work in the real world. Once you've done that and you get one sort of process going and you feel really confident about your ability to execute and deliver, then I think it makes a lot of sense to branch out. Again, kind of going back to that, if you're doing something that matters and it has an impact on your business, why would we want to make it linear and only do one process at a time? You want to start to branch out and cross-pollinate and teach the rest of the organization how to participate in these projects. So there is kind of a healthy tension. I mean, if I had my, I wouldn't recommend trying to start 10 processes all at once to start with, right? You have to narrow the focus a little bit and make sure you have critical mass of expertise on your team so that you can be successful. But as you're successful on the first one, the number of people who have that critical mass of expertise will grow and you can take on more parallel efforts. So
makes total sense.
Yeah.
We didn't rehearse this, but totally aligned here.
Right. Yeah. We're just two sides of the same coin on this one, I think.
True.
I think, there's another question about what tips do you have? And I think this question is to you, Jakob, in terms of picking a process-centered tech stack, maybe beyond Camunda, what are the kind of common themes, in that tech stack that you see, to be successful as a client adopting these technologies?
That's an interesting theme that's discussed, I believe, in different shapes and forms. So like this Gartner term hyperautomation, that's about the same question basically. Like, what's the tech stack that I should put together? And I would say it depends, of course, a bit on like the sort of use cases you're looking at. Think microservices orchestration versus, for example, human task orchestration. But when we think in a, let's say, universal, complete fashion, I would say you can consider, of course, process mining as, if I think like from start to like continuous improvement, process mining can be helpful for initial discovery of automation potential. And then you might use a tool for discovery of processes and also process bottlenecks, and process mining is the usual suspect for that. I wouldn't say it's mandatory, so I would be careful to only apply it where it really makes sense. There's a lot of noise around that topic right now. That's not always helpful. But it can, of course, be a helpful component. Then you have the actual automation part that will be Camunda, for example. And then you might have, if you look towards continuous improvement, Camunda comes with Optimize, which is an out-of-the-box BI product that, of course, already is like a Kickstarter to get insights. Of course, you can consider augmenting that with more in-depth data analytics products. So like along the lines of BI products, like, for example, Snowflake and others might be like increasingly interesting, actually. So you can integrate that in order to expand that capabilities of insights. When it comes to, okay, I need to orchestrate people, systems, devices, there are a lot of categories, so to speak, that can act as the glue layer between your process orchestration technology Camunda and the actual endpoints. For example, Apache Kafka. Like that would be a usual suspect for in an event-based architecture for microservices orchestration. Combining Camunda and Kafka is a very usual thing, for example. You can, of course, think along the lines of AI and wonder how to, or if it makes sense to involve machine learning in process execution, for example, to predict potential negative outcomes. I would say that unlike the Kafka thing, this is still more of a, let's say, white paper, flip chart sort of thing than actually happening a lot in the real world. It is happening, but often more in like pilot stages still, and in specific vertical setups like insurance, for example, fraud detection components. So maybe just to pause here, the final one that I've mentioned also in our interview is, of course, RPA. That's a pretty natural thing. So if you do have legacy that doesn't have API, RPA can be a great temporary setup at least, and would be a natural complement for an orchestration tech like Camunda. So just to name a few.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good list. I think, across our customer base, it seems like Kafka and Kubernetes are reoccurring themes, or some kind of containerization, right? Not just Kubernetes. There are several options, but that seems to be on the rise. And of course, there are different UI tech, tech choices that people will make, and that's kind of all over the map for us, right? For our clients will choose many different UI technologies, and of course, you can use any and all of those UI choices. So kind of it's just an interesting time, right? There's so much white space, to fill in and make those choices. And it kind of reminds me of the early 2000s, right? When you had to choose, database, app server, are we using, the Java tech stack or not? And there's a similar set of interesting choices now.
That is true. I would say this is like having been in this whole business, so to speak, also now for, I guess, 2 decades already. Like that always makes me feel bad when I'm reflecting on that. Like there's a few learnings that I've made myself that I'm like profoundly convinced about nowadays. And one of that is, if you're taking IT seriously, if you really want to be the Amazon of your industry, basically, like forget about buying one vendor's product to solve all your problems. Like this is still a theme, right? And still vendors are trying to position themselves also towards, for example, automation. It just never works out. Like live with the fact that you need to own your stuff and put together your stack. That's one piece of advice that I'm like sufficiently certain about to give with a certain assertiveness.
No, I think that's good advice. Let's see. I think kind of related to that on the security front. We talked about having multiple processes. We talked about tech stack. Does it present a challenge to managing security? When you have multiple processes running in Camunda, at a high level, what's your take on that?
Yeah, need to stay on a high level here, in parts because I'm not as proficient as our consultants and our partners, and in parts because it is really a complex topic that has so many different shapes. So, and that already is part of the answer. So security is always, I would argue, a challenge if you do it seriously. And we just got our ISO 27001 certification this year. We allow like getting ready for the SOC 2 certification and all of that. So it's a complex topic, and when you look at it in the context of, if you look at Camunda in the context of security, there are different ways to go about that. From Active Directory integration, single sign-on approaches, leveraging things like Keycloak, for example, which people do now increasingly, like all the way to what we just tackled with containerization. There's so many different ways to tackle security. I would say my summarized piece of advice in this context is one of Camunda's strengths is that it's very flexible and it comes with certain things out of the box, but of course not everything that you might want in your particular setup. The good news is since our customers are like the vast majority like in this global 10,000 space, and the vast majority using Camunda for mission critical process automation, like security is a usual thing to solve with Camunda. So it can absolutely be solved, but it always has to be solved in different ways. And again, I believe that's where partners like BP3 and our own experts can be of great help.
Yeah, no, I think that's really on point. I think I'll just speak to one aspect of it, which is how do you experience this as a user of processes, a consumer of processes? If you're participating in these processes that are built with Camunda or a process engine, the security is pretty straightforward, right? Like your single sign-on will work, across almost every case that I can think of across our customers. We've always been able to work through it. Behind the scenes, it may be complicated and it may be difficult to work through how security transposes down the stack. But to the end user, it should be a seamless experience, right? Just like the rest of your enterprise applications, I hope.
Yeah. That's I find that so natural that I totally forgot to mention it actually, but it's absolutely true.
Yeah, there was a time when every time you rolled out a new software system, right? Like,
that's not acceptable anymore.
Yeah, that's right. Let's see. I've got a question from Neil or Dutton. How much do potential customers typically show interest in like the open source aspects of Camunda? Is it something that you're talking to clients about on a regular basis, Jakob?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, again, the world is always getting more nuanced, and so it is regarding open source. So it starts with the license itself. When you look at companies like MongoDB, Elastic, and others, it's not actually open source licenses anymore in the sense of the original, open source initiative, the OSI, and the exact definitions. At the same time, they are arguing with the keywords free, like in free beer, open, like I can actually invest or inspect the source code, and I can also contribute back. So in that sense, the idea, of open source is very much alive and kicking, and now reflected in many different implementations. Like it's about community, it's about engagement, it's about transparency, it's about minimal vendor lock-in. And all of that, I believe, is incredibly important for all our customers, and often also something that we are discussing. So for example, the simple fact that our customers can actually inspect the entire source code also of the enterprise components. Like that makes stuff like, I forgot about the exact term, escrow. That typically makes escrow like entirely obsolete in the contracts. So that stuff is important. So I would say like this idea, free, open, community engagement, minimal vendor login, it's increasingly important. And this is typically achieved by making your products available under certain licenses that are sometimes the original, like first generation open source licenses, sometimes proprietary licenses like for Elastic, MongoDB, etc. Also for Camunda Cloud, but they all tick the same boxes in the sense of, let's make this possible.
Yeah, and I would say from our perspective too, we do have conversations with folks about the open source aspects of Camunda, either libraries that Camunda leverages or the fact that Camunda itself offers an open source version. And often those conversations are about, well, how do we get right with getting on an enterprise edition of Camunda, because we're getting serious about going to production and supporting our business. And I think it's just good practice to have that kind of, real support behind you when you're in production with software, right? That you don't sort of do that without a kind of an organization backing the software you're using. Otherwise, your own organization is backing the software, and that's not really where you want to be in production, I think.
Yeah, so that's like that might be okay for your, I don't know, GIMP paint tool or whatever, but not like you don't want to run your business on technology that like you don't have a certain reassurance for. So but that's so interesting, right? We're getting this increase from big enterprises that would never consider like not having a subscription, and still it's important for them that there is this version of Camunda that is free and open for the community. So like these two things, like they're not mutually exclusive, they actually complement each other.
Yeah, I think culturally that's really changed, right? It used to be that rewinding, I can't put an exact time frame on it, but people would really, if they wanted open source, it was because they wanted free in a sense. And now I sense that open source is considered a feature of a commercial product in a sense, rather than a separate thing and a separate market. It really is a feature that I can inspect all the source. I understand how it works if I need to, right? I can dig into a critical issue. Yeah, I think it's a really important feature for enterprise clients.
Yeah, it's actually there. You could actually maybe bucket it as a non-functional requirement, like similar to security, scalability, and often these when we have these conversations, often the questions are along those lines, like how big is the community, like how many people attend the forum, what's the vibe, is it alive and kicking? So that does make a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's a really healthy community. So I think that's another feature of the product.
Yeah, it's quite important.
Right. Well, let's see. Oh, I skipped one. Sorry, one out of order. So I'm gonna come back to it. Let's see. Just looking at the questions that have come in. Here's an interesting one. Where do you get inspiration for enhancements to Camunda? You guys have a great track record, I think, of adding great features to the product over time. Where do those ideas come from?
The answer is probably quite boring because it's like the usual thing. I would say there's two pillars that we are also very much aware of ourselves. The one is let's say the vision pillar. So we have a certain vision for this product that is in a way long-term and aspirational, and also sometimes a bit bold. So the universal process orchestrator, for example, is that, let's say, overarching theme and vision. Then innovations like with Camunda Cloud and the underlying ZB engine that is suddenly going from relational databases to event streaming as the persistence technology. That is part of that overarching vision. However, it then takes the aspect of scalability, etc., to the next level. And yes, people have asked for that, but I would say to a large degree it was also simply a big leap of faith from Daniel, our CTO, etc., regarding where the markets are going. So that's the vision part, and it's a bit like this. I don't even know if that's true, but this supposed statement about, was it Henry Ford, and customers asked me for a horse and I invented the car, bit like that. That's the vision pillar. But then, of course, you need the other pillar, which is you could say the feedback pillar in the broadest sense, or the community/customer pillar. So people ask for stuff. Hey, we like doing this and this. We would like to get that and that. I don't know, the Spring Boot starter integration that came from the community, for example. Security is a great example. So it's very important to bring these two things together as closely as possible. We might have great ideas, that's our vision, but if we're solving problems that no one has, that doesn't make sense. So going from vision to validation, so to speak, with customers and users of the free version, etc., and taking those inspirations from customers and users and validate them against, is this in scope of our vision? This is where these two pillars are closely intertwined, and all the ideas regarding enhancements of the product basically come from one of those two pillars. And individuals wise, vision wise, etc., sometimes, yes, certainly people like Daniel, myself, etc., but also our own engineers that develop certain ideas. So it's really a very collaborative effort, you could say.
Yeah, I think embedded in that answer, Jakob, you've given some advice that I think is interesting for anyone listening in their organization, right? To think about those two pillars. What are the innovative ideas that come out of your experience and expertise and context? And then secondly, listening. And I think the two things to listen to are, the feature, right? Hey, could it do this? Could you add this feature? Things that are centric around the project, the process, the product. And if you think about what you're delivering for your organization, think of it as a product that you can innovate on and improve in those two ways. But I think the other bit of listening is to listen to what problems, that people are trying to solve. And that may cause the cross-pollination to happen where you go, oh, well, I have a different way to solve that isn't necessarily the sort of obvious, get a faster horse, right?
Not totally. It's So yeah, but you're right. That's also lessons learned. It's always about problems, even in both pillars, about visions and about learnings. We're interested in problems, and sometimes people have ideas for solutions, but it's really first of all important to understand the problem.
Yeah. I think that's something I'm happy to say I learned from my team. That really have to listen to the problems and not just think about the next turn on the features that we want to add. So it's quite good.
Good team.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, one more question, and then I think for time we should wrap. And that question is, are there any we see the big trend in microservices. Do you see any kind of emerging technology trend that might be of similar impact?
Yeah,
or similarly widely adopted? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, of course, in a sense, I'm biased. But I guess that's acceptable because, but what comes to my mind is this: a few years ago, 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, the RPA hype basically emerged, and I still remember that I was sitting at that dinner in London with an analyst, doesn't matter who, and he was talking about RPA, and I was like, okay, what is that actually? And he was like, yeah, imagine digital hands that do tasks. And I had no idea what he was talking about, like digital hands. What do you mean? And it took me like a couple of years to understand, okay, we're talking about like macro recorder on steroids, basically, like from Windows. Of course, it's more than that, but like the core principle, like UI automation, basically.
Right.
And that was like, I'm still amazed by this because it really was not groundbreaking tech, but it was technology that solved a problem that was suddenly very, very big, basically. Local automation based on user interfaces because there wouldn't be an API. Like this problem has culminated to a certain point, and then it sort of exploded, like the solution exploded as a market. Super interesting to see, actually. And I believe that the microservices thing is fairly similar. Like in many ways, it's also not groundbreaking innovation, but it just like there was this right point in time when the problem was so big that the solution really made a lot of sense to a lot of organizations. And I see two things right now. One is about integration. A great example again. Integration has been around forever, like EAI and everything. But you're seeing, of course, certain integration products now taking off. Think Zapier, for example, like Bootstrap forever, then suddenly raised at a like super high valuation. Great example. They're solving an ancient problem in a, of course, like better new way. Similar like Airtable solves stuff better than Microsoft Access, but it's the same old problem. So they're doing that. And this problem again has culminated to an extent that there's a big demand for that. And I find it especially interesting to look at integration now when we're not talking about fancy SaaS apps that have proper APIs. Like, yes, I want to put a row into Airtable when I get a message on Slack. Okay, honestly, that's easy. But what about my like homegrown COBOL system, core banking system that calculate interest rates? Like, how do I get access to that? And I believe that is an old problem that needs to be solved now in a new way again. And in particular, and that's the other trend that I'm seeing, and particularly in the context of end-to-end process orchestration. Like I'm serious about that one. Like the writings on the wall. Okay, we've solved local UI-based task automation. We have an idea about local integration. We really need to bring everything together in a reliable, scalable way for end-to-end process automation. And that's why I see Camunda, of course, in a very interesting position.
Yeah. No, and I think, your talk track reminds me or makes me mindful of the fact that one of the things that makes it so hard to predict technology trends is that the context matters so much, right? So you have the same idea in kind of different decades coming across or expressed in different ways. And then if it's expressed the right way and hits the right context, it really blows up, right? You just see it everywhere, yeah. And it gets graded
It's
up.
like surfing. I always like to think of that. It's a bit like surfing. You can have your deck. You can sit on your deck like all day long. But then eventually, like a wave will come, and when the wave comes and you're on that deck, well, you're lucky. So yeah. At the end of the day, that's quite often the mechanics at play.
And then you just have to stay on the board.
That's true, but that's also the fun.
Right. No, that's right. Well, thank you so much, Jakob. I really appreciate you doing this. And thank you to everyone who was able to join us for viewing and joining us for episode 5 of Driven 2021. I do have a random selection raffle to announce. I'm told that Carter Brooking is the winner of our Beats earpods this week. I almost said beer pods. That's not actually the prize. It's Beats earpods. So is it Friday yet, right? So congratulations, Carter. We'll be reaching out to you shortly so that you can receive your prize. And I want to do another quick reminder. Our next episode is next week. Instead of our usual 2-week cycle, we're doing it next week, partly in favor of the Thanksgiving holiday in the US. So it'll be Tuesday, November 16th, featuring an RPA expert roundtable at 11 a.m. Eastern time. This roundtable will answer your questions about best practices for RPA implementation with some of the world's best practitioners. And if you haven't registered for Driven, make sure to do so. You don't want to miss out on our conference t-shirts sent directly to your door. Registration will also send you a reminder to join our live stream. So we look forward to seeing you here in 1 week, and you'll see some more great content. Jakob, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.